Okay, so welcome everybody to our PSA online session. And before we begin today's session, I want to just have a couple of announcements here to share with you. One moment. Okay. Okay, so very soon, June 15th, the proposal deadline will approach. So if you are wanting to present at the 5th International Edgar Allan Poe Conference, we're holding it from April 7th through 10th, 2022. So next year at the Omni Parker House Hotel in Boston, you need to get those proposals in. So it can be on basically anything Poe related. We just need double-spaced 250-word abstracts. Sorry, hold on, I gotta move this, for papers, or 1,000-word abstracts for the roundtable discussions or panels. And we want those sent to Philip Phillips, and he's requesting that you put in the subject heading Poe Takes Boston. So please, please, please get in those proposals if you haven't done so already. And then if you recall, those of you who have been on these meetings before, I mentioned this the last meeting, we're going to actually have 2 PSA online sessions in June. We are using our PSA online sessions to record our panels for the ALA. If you are a PSA member and you're able to come to these online sessions we've been having each month, you don't have to pay anything to attend our June meetings. But if you do want to see these panels during the ALA, you will have to register for ALA. So as usual, I'm going to make the recordings available to our membership. So if that's all you're interested in, I guess you don't have to go to the ALA, but of course, many of us want to attend other panels at the ALA. So on Friday, June 11th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we will hold the session Poe's Environmental Humanities. So essentially it will be, I don't want to say we're not formal when we do our monthly sessions, but sometimes we're a little more informal than a conference session. So these will be basically like we're watching a conference session, and then after all the presenters present, there'll be a Q&A, and all of it will be recorded, and then that recording will go to the ALA for them to post. And then the following, like we'll have the weekend, and then the following Monday on June 14th at 2 p.m. we will have our second ALA session recording, and that's the session called Poe in the Wireless Classroom. Okay, so without further ado, I will turn the meeting over to Richard, and we will have How I Got Started with Poe, Part 2.
Thank you very much, Amy. And welcome to everybody. I enjoyed the first session of How I Got Started with Poe. I expect that we'll all enjoy the second one just as much. We had 6 speakers in the first case in February, and the video is up on the website of the Poe Studies Association, as this one will be. Today's second part features 7 speakers, and I'll introduce the speakers, and then we'll have their presentations, which will be approximately 5 to 7 minutes each, on how they got started with Poe. And then we'll have a Q&A with our speakers. So this should be great fun. Let me go to the introductions. And thanks to the speakers for providing them. Jackie Pierazzo completed her undergraduate degree at the University of Campinas in Brazil in 2011. She obtained her master's degree at the University of Porto, that is in Portugal, in 2016 in Anglo-American Studies with a dissertation titled Between Terror and Sublime, the Female Characters in Berenice, Morella, and Ligeia. She is currently a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Arts and Humanities of the University of Porto in Portugal. She is also the manager of the Center for English, Translation, and Anglo-Portuguese Studies Digital Lab, and is currently working on the creation of a digital edition of Edgar Allan Poe's writings of terror. John Gruser is Senior Research Scholar at Sam Houston State University and the author and editor of several books, most recently the monograph Edgar Allan Poe and His 19th Century Counterparts, and the Broad View edition of Pauline Elizabeth Hopkins' Hager's Daughter. He is the editor of the forthcoming essay collection, Animals in the Classics: How Natural History Inspired Great American Fiction, and A Literary Life of Sutton E. Griggs, The Man on the Firing Line. Great title. Susan Amper is a professor of English at the City University of New York. She contributes frequently to the Macmillan blog, where she contributes reviews and other commentary, and she posts on Poe's mysteries and on sundry hoaxes. Tracy Ware received his PhD from the University of Western Ontario in 1984, where he taught a course on 19th century American literature. He subsequently served as a Killam postdoctoral fellow at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and he later taught Romantic and postcolonial literatures at Bishop's University in Quebec. He then moved to Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, where he taught Canadian literature until retiring in 2018. Derek Pollard is editor of Till One Day the Sun Shall Shine More Brightly, the poetry and prose of Donald Ravel, author of the poetry collection On the Verge of Something Bright and Good, and co-author with Derek Henderson of the poetry collection Inconsequentia. He currently serves as series editor for the Poets on Poetry, a series founded by Donald Hall. Previously, he served as associate editor at Interim, a journal of poetry and poetics, as poetry and nonfiction editor at Witness, and as associate editor at New Issues, Poetry and Prose. Mary Beth Shade holds Masters in Communication, Speech, Language, and Hearing Disorders, a doctorate in naturopathy, and certificates in homeopathy. She is a retired medical speech pathologist who has also been in private practice as an intuitive medium. She has participated in cases with local police, FBI, and victims' rights attorneys. She has lectured for the International Association Near-Death Studies, and she is especially proud of having received an honorable mention from the James River Writers and the Poe Museum for her poetry in the Poe Inspires Contest 2018 Poe Birthday Bash. And Renata Filipov is Professor of English and Literature in English at the Federal University of Sao Paulo, Brazil. Welcome to all, and let us begin then with our first speaker, Jackie Pirazzo.
Hello, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, maybe. I will just share my screen. Okay, is everybody seeing my screen? Okay. So first I want to thank Amy for hosting these sessions. They have been really interesting and it allows us to participate from such a distance. So it's been amazing. And also Richard Kopley for hosting these How I Got Started with Poe presentations. It's actually really inspirational and it's really interesting to see how all of these Poe scholars that I admire so much actually got started reading and researching Poe. So it's been an amazing experience. And I also want to say that I feel a little bit intimidated to be here with all of you because I feel like I'm just at the beginning of my Poe journey, but I also think that it hopefully might be interesting to see how people from other countries and different backgrounds got started with Poe. So I want to start from the beginning, the very beginning. So I'm actually from a very small town in the interior of Brazil in the state of São Paulo called Aramina, which is unknown even to people from cities nearby. And growing up, we did not have any libraries or bookshops that were accessible to us. And at that time, and up until I was 16 and 17, there were no bookstores delivering there either. My town was not even in most of the maps, and I'm very proud to have found a map of Brazil that actually includes my town to show here today. And all of my passion for literature and even horror started with my mom. And she will kill me if she knows I'm sharing this. Thank God she doesn't speak English. But it is ironic because she actually hates horror and she's afraid of everything. But she never stopped encouraging me and taught me that being afraid was okay and that it could be even cool. So she used to buy books from a traveler bookseller that used to come to her workplace every other month. So to keep me going for 2 months with the books she got, she would divide them into smaller sections that we were only allowed to read 1 or 2 pages every night. So she would come to my room and read with me, but they were all fairy tales with happy endings, and I did not enjoy that very much. I actually, not at all, I hated them. So she would get creative and we would create our own stories with alternative endings that almost always end up with the prince falling down a pit or something of the sort. And she always encouraged my imagination, but she would not allow me to go any further than that. And I'm glad she didn't, because I was about 5 years old at that time. And I kind of like to think that we were creating our own Poe-like stories even before I knew who Poe was. And I also felt like the little boy from Tim Burton's short animation Vincent, especially this part that says, while other kids read books like Go Jane Go, Vincent's favorite author is Edgar Allan Poe. Then at school, I had the pleasure of having one of those amazing teachers that really encouraged us to read whatever we wanted and do whatever we wanted to. And her name is Claudia Borges. And she made us read a lot of Machado de Assis, a Brazilian author that Renata already talked about and that had an interesting connection to Poe. And she also introduced me to a Brazilian author called Álvares de Azevedo, who wrote some short stories that have similar motifs to Poe's. And I actually had the pleasure of talking about him on the session about Poe in Brazil back in January with Renata. But he died really young at about 20 years old and did not left a lot of stories, so I needed more. That's when my teacher suggested reading Edgar Allan Poe. And I started with this edition that I always have with me, which is actually a couple of adaptations from some of Poe's stories by another Brazilian author called Clarice Lispector. And that's how I fell in love, especially with The Mask of the Red Death and The Black Cat. And even though this edition is older than I am, it is from 1974, and I was born in 89, it was the one we had available. And it was probably not even this one, because at my school, they used to cover up the covers of the books so we wouldn't ruin them. So I never got to see the actually cover of the book I was reading. And then I found this years later, and now it travels with me wherever I go. I don't bring my Poe with me to job interviews, but I bring this edition, so it's getting a little bit used and worn. But her adaptations made Poe's stories really interesting and accessible to me as a teenager who was yet to start studying English. So I really love this book. And then I just could not go back. And to conclude, I just need to mention another important turning point in my Poe journey, which was the discovery of Jeffrey Savoy's website of the Edgar Allan Poe Society of Baltimore, that allowed me to read all those versions and all those texts by Poe and about Poe in English later on, and made me want to finally study the author and the revisions of his stories. And that journey started back in 2013 when I decided to write my master's dissertation on Berenice, Morel, and Ligeia. And it is still going on today while I'm writing my PhD thesis on Poe's horror and its evolution throughout all of those different publications. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jackie. And John, you're up.
Okay. I just want to show this book because it's all about this book, or at least a book very similar to it. I'm just going to share my screen. Let me see here. Can you see my screen?
No.
Sorry about that. Let me go back to how about now?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. I think you'll see a lot of similarities to what Jacqueline was talking about in what I have to say. It all has to do with a book, a copy of the Modern Library's 126-page complete tales and poems of Edgar Allan Poe, published in 1938 and including a short introduction by Hervey Allen. My mother, who died suddenly in last October, had used it in a class she took as an English and journalism major at Marquette University, Amy, in Milwaukee in the early 1950s. Her maiden name, Eileen Cullen, was written in big, bold blue script inside the front cover. I had encountered Poe in grade school in the 1960s, being introduced to the best-known poems and some of the shorter tales, such as The Telltale Heart. In the summer of 1973, after finishing 8th grade, but before starting high school, I set out to read at night all 73 of Poe's stories in sequence in my mother's book, which even then was showing some signs of wear. So here is the spine of the book. Here's the title page of the book. Here's the table of contents. When I would finish a tale, I would place a pencil dot next to its title in the table of contents. I didn't make it, managing to complete 50 or so stories over that roughly 2-month period. What prevented me from reaching my goal were all of the vocabulary words that I dutifully looked up. Some of the briefer tales required me to consult a thick dictionary only a few times, while others necessitated that I find the meaning of dozens of terms. My mother never got the book back. It remained in my possession for another 45 years, becoming increasingly shabby as I attended college, studied for a master's and a PhD, journeying from Wisconsin to Indiana to New Jersey, back to Wisconsin, and then back to New Jersey, where it sat in a bookshelf, having lost its cover, in various offices during the nearly 3 decades that I taught at Kean University. When I took my current position at Sam Houston State University in Texas in September 2018, I had to give away at least 95% of the books I had accumulated over the years. It just tore my heart out. Because its binding was completely shot and pages were falling out, I made the tough decision to part with this book that held such memories, not only of my mother's younger days and that summer I spent immersed in Poe, but also of my first published peer review article. Lygia and Orientalism, which appeared in Studies in Short Fiction in 1989, did not cite the version of the story in Thomas Mabbott's standard scholarly edition of Poe's works, but rather my mother's old Modern Library collections. You can see the footnote there in which I mentioned it. Although much of my scholarship over the course of my career has been in African-American literature and culture and post-colonial literature and theory, Poe has been an abiding presence. In addition to several articles on the topic, I've edited an anthology, A Century of Detection, 20 Great Mystery Stories, 1841 to 1940, and published a book, Race, Gender, and Empire in American Detective Fiction, on the genre, all of which have related directly and indirectly to Poe. Moreover, a dozen essays that I've written about the author have appeared in books and journals over the years, and in 2019, Bloomsbury published Edgar Allan Poe and his 19th century American counterparts, which won the Patrick F. Quinn Award for the best monograph on Poe, in no small part because it had absolutely no competition that year. I believe that my involvement with the Poe Studies Association, PSA of course, began with the first International Poe Conference held in Richmond in 1999. Certainly from that point on, I was active in this organization that has enabled me to meet and work with so many generous, brilliant, wonderful people, several of whom are tuning in right now. And thus, this organization has greatly enriched my life and my scholarship. I have been an Edgar Allan Poe Review board member, a PSA board member at large, and between 2012 and 2014, PSA president, affording me the opportunity to participate in the 2012 Poe, Hawthorne, and Emerson International Conference in Florence, at which I was able to share my research on the honest-to-God Italian mummy that partly inspired the Cask of Amontillado, and to become, wait for it, the Edgar Allan Poe consultant for John Jobson's 2014 film based on that story and entitled Terroir. And if you've never seen Terroir, that's Terroir. I highly recommend it. It's on one of the streaming services. Here is an image from it. That's Keith Carradine. He is the main character in the film. Proving to be the gift that keeps on giving, the PSA named me an honorary member last year, maybe because people thought I didn't have much time left. My longtime colleague, Carol Schaefer-Koros, seen here receiving her own PSA honorary membership plaque. The person who was chair of the Department of English when I was hired at Kean in 1990 was the one who wrote the citation for my honorary membership. Here's my final paragraph. When Richard Kopley asked me whether I wanted to participate in how I got started with Poe, I immediately thought of my mother's book and regretted no longer having it. Over the years, students would come to my office and tell me how much Poe meant to them. That often caused me to find my battered Modern Library edition on one of my shelves, tell them about the book, and show them my dots next to the stories in pencil. In anticipation of this presentation, a few months ago, I ordered a copy of the 1938 Complete Tales and Poems of Edgar Allan Poe from an online bookseller. It's not the same, of course, but it looks very much like the original, but with the cover intact, even though some of the pages are threatening to fall out. In homage to my mother, I have signed my own name in big blue letters inside the front cover. Thank you very much.
That was great, John. Thank you. Thank you. And we proceed then to Susan Amper. Susan?
Hi. I'm a bit of a late bloomer in terms of Poe, and I think that's because I always considered him a horror writer, which I do not like. And I'm not a fan, which is unfortunate since quite a few movies are horror movies. Let me share my screen if I can. So as I mentioned at the earlier session on Poe beginnings, I don't have any childhood memories of Poe. We were a family of readers. There were books everywhere. We went to the public library almost weekly. But my passion as a preteen, I'm sorry, I'm laughing already, was for things like Nancy Drew. And here I am, you know, on my 13th birthday, and I got the most recent, what was then the most recent edition of Nancy Drew. And I also sort of decided at that time that I was probably a little too old for Nancy Drew. And from this outfit on my 13th birthday, you can see what I decided next was to become a fashion influencer. So in any case, I moved from Nancy Drew to some more classic mysteries that everybody's familiar with. And of course, not my only genre, but one of my favorites. I'm also an avid film buff. And I know that Beth mentioned at that last meeting that there are no good Poe films, although perhaps now John's will serve as that. And I absolutely cannot stand seeing Vincent Price in anything other than Edward Scissorhands. So just exactly where Poe begins for me is a bit hazy. But I do remember for some reason my first reaction to Ligeia. It just kind of sticks in my mind. And here, as you can see, is the final paragraph of Ligeia. And let me just read it. And there streamed forth into the rushing atmosphere of the chamber. I'm sorry, I can hardly see this. 1 second. Of the chamber, huge masses of long and disheveled hair. It was blacker than the raven wings of the midnight, and now slowly opened the eyes of the figure which stood before me. Here then, at least I shrieked aloud, can I never be mistaken? These are the full and the black and the wild eyes of my lost love of the lady Ligeia. And I went, oh! And then I laughed because I don't know why, but But that was actually the only time I think that I was ever sort of surprised by Poe in that way. Maybe it was the capital letters, but in any case, before grad school, I thought of Poe, as I said, as a horror writer. So I didn't really approach him. I didn't pay much attention to him. And when I was in college, at NYU, I fell in love with Nathaniel Hawthorne and then, of course, Herman Melville. And I wrote my master's thesis on Herman Melville, and I thought I might be able to work that into a PhD dissertation. And I adjuncted before as I was going to grad school. And it was when I started teaching Poe that my interest was sort of turned on. And I was an adjunct at Pace University, one of my first jobs, teaching a survey course in 19th century American literature. The class was reading The Black Cat, a story I hated because it never made any sense to me. A man gets drunk, kills his cat, burns down his house, claims to accidentally kill his wife, and is found out when police find her greatly decayed body behind a wall in the basement. So what? Why should students read this story or care? I remember discussing this with Tom, my husband at the time, saying, what am I going to say about this? And neither one of us could come up with anything. So just before the class, again, this is sort of really a strong memory that I have. I was sitting in the cafeteria at Pace, reading the story again and rereading the story and thinking, what the hell am I going to say in class today? And then I read this passage while I was here in the cafeteria. And I had this, I got it when I read this passage. So let me just show you the passage that I read. Which again, you'll recognize. Uplifting an axe, I aimed at the head of the animal, which of course would have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. Goaded by the interference into a rage more than demoniacal, I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot without a groan. And I thought, oh, wait a minute. This sentence in red is the one that made me pause. And when I said, but this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife, that's a very strange way to say that. I thought that's a passive. Why is he writing that as a passive sentence? And then I thought, I got it. I know what happened. Although many scholars disagree. I said, the wife is already dead. And it's at this point where he's dragging her down to the basement. Again, where I say you sort of get this aha moment, and then I laughed. This is why she fell dead upon the spot without a groan. It's because she's already dead. In any case, from the cafeteria, I went over, I actually called my husband from the phone. This was before cell phones. I said, I got it, since we were both sort of tortured by this story. Now, that wasn't the whole of figuring out the story, but I did love the idea of discovering an unsolved mystery in a classic author. And it became my first published essay, also in studies in short fiction. Since then, I found really more than a dozen stories that I can confidently call solvable mysteries. So that's where I started with Poe. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Susan. Very interesting. Okay, so our next speaker will be Tracy Ware. Tracy, you're up.
Can you hear me? Everything all right? Okay. Like some of the previous speakers in this series, I received valuable help starting out from established Poe critics and from the Poe Studies Association. Like them, I also had an exaggerated sense of the importance of my own work. My experience since I became a Canadianist is probably not typical in other ways, but I'm pleased to note the continuing importance of Poe in my research and teaching. In 1985, I was a sessional instructor at the University of Western Ontario, spending most of my time marking essays for the composition courses that were the only teaching available. That gave me an understanding of marking that stayed with me, but it did not provide the teaching experience that I needed. When the English department announced in the summer of 1985 that there was a possibility of teaching a course on American literature to 1885, I applied for it and got it, and it turned out to be the most challenging teaching of my career. I was expected to replicate in 6 weeks of daily teaching the course regularly offered during the year. though I was very gratified to hear that only one of the Leatherstocking novels would be sufficient, as opposed to the 3 that were taught during the year. I was not a specialist in the subject, though I had taken a course on 19th century American literature as a graduate student. That helped me through the 2 weeks on Hawthorne, Poe, and Melville at the center of the course. How I got through the weeks before and after that is a more difficult question. If Anne Bradstreet and Edward Taylor proved easier than expected, some more recalcitrant authors had me working long hours that summer. While preparing the lectures, a colleague suggested that I write something on one of the texts. It would, he said, rightly confirm that I had taken the course seriously, and it might even qualify me for another course in that area if one ever became available. Of all the authors on the course, I was most taken with Poe, whom I had read since I was young, as had many of my students. And it was William Wilson that was the most compelling of the 7 stories in the Norton Anthology that I used that summer. In the fall of that year, I held a postdoctoral fellowship at Dalhousie, and I attended the 1986 Northeast MLA in New Brunswick, New Jersey. I well remember an extraordinary session on Poe with excellent papers from Jonathan Auerbach, Fred Madden, and Mary DeJong. But what was even more important for me was hearing Robert Regan. If anyone remembers Robert Regan, I heard him give a paper on Poe's Holy Friars, Confession and the Role of the Reader. Regan noted the connections between William Wilson and Zvetan Todorov's The Fantastic that were beginning to interest me. When I wrote him after, he responded with encouragement along with a copy of his influential article on Poe and Hawthorne that I think some of us will remember. I started thinking about these matters in relation to my teaching experience, and by September, I had a detailed proposal ready for the next year's NEMBA. After it was accepted, all I had to do was write the paper. I started with a giddy idea of reading all the criticism on William Wilson ever written. It's never a bad thing to try to read as much as possible, but the very mention of Todorov reveals that Poe criticism, of course, is not always in English. And I have at best a bluffer's knowledge of French. Moreover, Freudian criticism alone could quickly become overwhelming, especially when joined with the kind of literary theory that was then having a field day with Poe. If I was ever going to write my paper, I would have to limit myself to a reading of William Wilson that centered on the description of Bransby's schoolhouse, especially on this passage. There was really no end to its windings, to its incomprehensible subdivisions. It was difficult at any given time to say with certainty upon which of its 2 stories one happened to be. I seized on that pun, and I still think it's important. 2 stories in William Wilson, but you don't know which one you're on. That's it. Regan had said in his paper that the question of whether there are 2 Wilsons or 1 was a question best referred to Todorov and his theory of the fantastic. When he was kind enough to tell me that the pun on the 2 stories of the schoolhouse seemed both valuable and new, I needed no further encouragement. I argued that when Wilson wonders if there's someone else with his name and personal history, or if he is just imagining it, his hesitation anticipates a reader's reaction to the story. And hesitation is the word that Todorov used to get at that reaction. And if such hesitation is found elsewhere in the fiction that Todorov surveys, then the whole genre is self-reflexive. Poe certainly was, since William Wilson uses his own date of birth, as we all know, and his experience in English schools in the text of William Wilson. In that happy early phase of my career, the connection between teaching and research was not hard to find. After 7 years at Bishop's, a small university in Quebec, I moved to Queens in 1994 and then became a specialist in Canadian literature, and I'm now professor emeritus. With many theses to supervise and some involvement in journals and the McGill Queen's University Press, I reluctantly moved away from Poe and American literature. But in the last 2 years of my career, I was pleased to teach a course on Poe and Hawthorne when the department was short in American literature instructors. I found, and I'll be happy to go in like about this and to hear from you, I found that Hawthorne, that is, had changed drastically in the 30 years since I taught the course previously, but Poe remained as compelling as he had ever been 30 years ago. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Tracy. Derek, your turn.
My goodness, what an absolute pleasure, everyone. Amy, thank you. And Richard, I can't thank you enough for organizing these panels. It's just an incredible opportunity for us to hear origin stories from such a deeply committed and accomplished group of Poe scholars. It's an honor for me to be involved. I'd like to start by pointing out the obvious. Nearly to a person across both of these panels, we've been connecting Poe to our earlier lives, to our childhoods and our pre-career reading, when it was the unmitigated pleasure of discovery and the revel of creative expression that directed our attention. And for so many of us, it was Poe who first invited that deep dive into American literature we've continued to pursue ever since. It's that aspect of Poe's legacy, his enduring popularity within the American imaginary, that makes the case most convincingly to me for why Poe and Poe's writing continue to matter. It's not just that Poe is popular, please don't get me wrong, for if that were the case, we might equally be considering the significance to the canon of Danielle Steele's, pun intended, I'm afraid, body of work, which is a conversation and perhaps a controversy for another day. It's that Poe's writing, including the innovations he brought to genre, prosody, and metaphysics, continues to inflect so much of the world's cultural production, highbrow, lowbrow, and all those extraordinary places in between, because it continues to fascinate us. Poe's writing continues to appeal because it's so unrelentingly exact in invoking the uncanny and the abject. The mirror it holds up is a carnival mirror we never seem to tire of. And Poe's command of language and of invention is simply astonishing. All the more so as we carry on investigating it through different lenses and in different contexts. Which gets me to my own childhood introduction to Poe's work. I was a primary school student at Amberley Elementary in Portage, Michigan. Although my memory is a little unclear these many years on, I want to say that it was near Halloween. The weather already turned toward winter, the days gone gray and somber. This was during the period when the Dewey Decimal System was still very much a part of the public school curriculum. Already I was finding every excuse to spend time in the library, putting my knowledge of Dewey's classification system to the test. Like you, I was an avid reader from an early age, and by this point I was increasingly gravitating toward works of vivid imagination and atmospheric prose and poetry. I also had a thing for records, which is how I got to know Poe. It was one of the Cadman recordings from the mid-1970s. I forget which one now, although I do distinctly recall at some point listening to The Pit and the Pendulum, wanting desperately to turn on the lights in the room, but being too captivated and too frightened by the story to get up to do so. We were only allowed to listen to records in the AV room, which was set off from one of the corners in the library. The room, muffled and dark, lined with a bank of portable record players, each accompanied by well-worn off-brand headphones that, in my memory, appear remaindered from the US Navy, was seemingly custom made for wide-eyed encounters with Poe via Vincent Price and other notable masters of the macabre. I can say with certainty that I'd recently discovered Monster Mash. Seeing the cover of that Cadman album, it's hardly a stretch to understand why I found myself checking it out immediately and reserving space at one of the record stations. It was from there, although also like a number of you only quite some time later in graduate school, that I found myself returning to Poe, aiming to contribute to the exceptional work many of you are doing to recuperate his poetry, which has for too long, the Raven aside, although in that case also too often, been considered an adjunct to Poe's fiction in the best of his critical prose. Thank you again, everyone, for making time on a Monday afternoon to gather together and hear more stories of how we got started with Poe. I truly appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Derek. I love that AV room. So our next speaker will be Mary Beth. Mary Beth?
Thank you. My first introduction to Poe was the cursory reading of his Raven by the nuns in Catholic school. And it'd be years later, on my honeymoon, we visited the Amity Street home. But I recall very little because we were in the middle of a big fight. I never gave Poe another thought. For years, I meditated daily. Probably living in Southern California, it lent itself to the woo-woo sciences of metaphysics. And then I began to realize that I had a skill called mediumship. I believe the skill came from working for so many years with people who couldn't speak, communication disorders, hard of hearing, cognitive disorders, but also because I think the nuns scared me so much, I spent most of my high school years out of body in an altered state. So I got pretty good at it. I wasn't your, let me see, where did I leave off? Okay. I wasn't your biggest skeptic, but I have to admit, when I go to watch demonstrations done by other mediums, my friend and I would sit in the audience and whisper to each other, making fun of the Hollywood mediums who contacted famous dead people. Little did I know that I was going to become one of them. But I had started to get intuitive information for police that was correct, and so I began to really pay attention, and I got serious that for me, this was all real. I did a lot of what's called automatic or channeled inspirational writing, and I often wrote children's stories that I read to the kids in the neighborhood. I never published except for a poem that I wrote in high school. It'd be years later, in about 1999, after a bad slip and fall at the hospital where I was their medical speech pathologist. I'd started having terrible headaches, and one afternoon, about 1:30 in the afternoon, I don't take painkillers, but I gave in and lay down to get away from a severe headache. When I woke up from the nap, I was surrounded by pages and pages and pages of handwritten documents, poems, and a short story in which he introduced himself to me. I don't even remember if the headache was gone, but I was so excited to see the writing that I made the fatal mistake of calling my ex-husband and saying, "Hey, listen to this, listen to this." His response was to ask me if I was drunk and why I was reading him Edgar Allan Poe, Pearls Before Swine, I guess, my big mistake. When I started to read what I had written, it was unmistakably Poe. It had fascinated me, and so I continued for the next months and months and months when meditating, inviting him to come and talk to me some more. And up until this point, as a medium, I had really just been contacting, like I said, information for the police, missing and abducted people, but then, you know, for people who've lost loved ones who've crossed over. Okay. So as I continued to ask him to come more and more, the poems began to come with a frenzy, and probably up to somewhere over 30 or more. And then he seemed to go silent, and I finally began the task of researching what the poems meant. People asked me what it was like when it happened. It was like a dream, and I was listening to a monologue. Seriously, he never let me get a word in edgewise. He chose the topics of conversation. I just wrote and wrote and wrote, and as I've become accustomed to in my automatic writing. The interesting thing for me wasn't that only as I began to research that this poet was coming through, but as I researched, I found that Poe had a university professor by the name of George Long. That's my dad. Poe had also critiqued the short story about a Jack Long. That's my brother. I had moved around and found that he and I walked in the same neighborhoods: Albany, New York City, the Bronx, and surrounding areas where I lived and worked myself. I'd worked in his Boston neighborhoods and many other places that he'd haunted. His timeline dates were familiar, even down to the Griswold stories, and I had been in the same places as he had been. Remember, I'd already been to his place in Baltimore, but hadn't remembered it. What were the poems about? He spoke about getting revenge on Griswold, his foster father, his loves, his hates, and was just back to set the record straight about misunderstandings, he referred to them. Everything, the topics were everything from impotence to his apology to women writers, how he died, and best of all, the answer to his dying words. When he'd quit talking and I asked why, I begged him to keep talking to me, but he said it was my turn to come up with the prose to explain all of the poems. He was funny, he was articulate, he was irreverent, and sometimes pretty bitter. I suddenly got pretty full of myself, And like a lot of us, we feel that Poe is our best friend. I Googled to see if anyone else had done what I had done, in other words, channel Poe. And I was shocked and a little bit more than upset when I realized that a woman by the name of Lizzie Dutton had beat me to it about 12 years after Poe had died. I was crushed. So now I'm not only in love with a dead man, but jealous of a dead woman. Ugh. My story gets even a little bit more bizarre in that as a medical speech pathologist working in the local hospital, imagine my shock. Now I'd already worked for some 30 years working with head injury patients and stroke, etc. I walked into the room of a patient, looked at the chart, and what was the name of the adult male patient but Edgar Allan Poe. You can't make this stuff up. I was disappointed at the time because I would have loved to have questioned him about who in the heck would have named him that. Was he a relative? But unfortunately, the man, I believe, as I recall, had had a stroke, so I wasn't able to ask him any questions. I do hope to publish, but I'm my own worst enemy and critic. Who would read it? Where would I bring it? So I pick away at it and just remind myself there's always someday, and when he's ready to come back and tell me it's time. And to just tell you, the funny thing was when he stopped talking, I said, well, all right, Carl, dang it. If you're not going to finish this, send me a good editor. And he actually did. So we'll see. And if we have a time at the end, I wouldn't mind, and I'd be humbled to read one of his many poems and see what you think. Anyway, thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mary Beth. Well, to round out the presentations, we turn to Renata. Renata?
Well, good afternoon once again. First of all, let me say that this experience of attending the forum has been very enlightening, especially during these yet very confusing pandemic times, worse than ever here in Brazil. Well, I would also like to thank Amy once again for organizing the sessions and Richard for letting me in on this one. I can start with a weird statement. Poe found me. Let me explain that somewhat megalomaniac statement. I first came across Edgar Allan Poe's name when, aged 14 or so, I visited the São Paulo International Book Fair. Going from booth to booth without much aim or author in mind, I saw a tiny little book sitting on one of the shelves, and for some particular reason not quite clear at the time, my eye was immediately caught, and nothing else mattered. It was a book titled Great Tales and Poems of Edgar Allan Poe, 21 short story masterpieces plus 34 narrative and lyric poems. Here I have the book. It's pretty worn out, of course, given the years. This book was published by Washington Square Press in New York City, copyright 1940, but lacking actual publication date in my edition or editors' names. Well, I bought it anyhow, without thinking twice, and devoured it. Devoured every single page over and over again, to my mom's dismay and deep scare. Fascination was the word I can now think of to express how I felt upon that initial encounter. Years later, when I entered university and ended up by majoring in English, Portuguese, and French from the São Paulo State University, Poe was there again, among the several authors I read, including Charles Baudelaire and Machado de Assis. My mentioning them together is no surprise, as they appear in several of my studies and papers. Poe has since haunted my studies and research projects. I wrote my MA thesis on the fantastic and the oniric, having Poe's tales and Baudelaire's prose poems as material. I joined the Poe Studies Association back in 2002, when I was still working on my PhD dissertation and focusing on Poe's and Baudelaire's aesthetic and poetic theories, especially the question of fragments in their works. In fact, I attended the Poe International Conference in that same year, a conference held in Towson, Maryland, but I only moderated a panel at that moment. I presented my studies in the following conferences dedicated to Poe: in 2009 in Boston, the Bicentennial Conference, and also in 2015 in New York City. I also attended and presented my studies during the joint events on Emerson, Hawthorne, and Poe in 2006 in Oxford and 2012 in Florence, as well as the panel discussions held on Poe at the 2010 and 2011 ACLA conferences, organized by Aaron Esplin and some other people. I've also published quite extensively on Poe, presented papers at national and international conferences, organized events in Brazil, and more recently taught his stories at graduate and undergraduate levels, and supervised studies that oftentimes focus on Poe's works, as well as horror and the Gothic. In short, reading Poe has given me pleasure, as well as plenty of material to study and work on at academic level for a few decades now. I feel, therefore, that I'm constantly getting started with Poe. I cannot say that I got started at a specific moment and that I no longer continue getting started with him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renata. Thank you so much. Well, I think we're at the point where we can be unmuted and ask questions of our speakers and just have a great conversation. I'll look for hands up, and Amy will back me up if I miss a hand.
Yes, and I've gone ahead. If you're having issues with your microphone, you can type in the chat and I'll keep an eye on that as well. But we prefer, if you can, to ask your question on the mic. Thank you.
Can I just very quickly say what an absolute pleasure to hear these stories. Thank you, everyone. In the previous panel in this, I seem to have taken pages full of notes just in this brief session that we've had. So what a privilege and a pleasure to listen to all of these stories.
And
Alex,
for everybody, is my mic open enough for you to hear?
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask Susan Amper that she's done some things in Poe studies way back, but did you ever find a Poe story that you could read without remaking it?
I would disagree with that, saying remaking it. I have not remade them.
And I apologize for that.
Yeah, there are some stories that well, in fact, that I'm still sort of mystified by. And although I will have trouble with, I think Poe is more literal than most of you would say in terms of how I write about him. I see him writing in a sense what he means, but I mean, there are things that are completely beyond me. One of them being Eureka. I mean, I can't figure that one out for the world. But others of his stories, I mean, I'd like to figure out Berenice and Marilla and others, but no, some of them I have not gotten to say exactly what I'm saying. I do though have 13 of them, and I'll tell you about them someday.
And Susan, I did start with a joke. I really wanted to lead into your sense of, especially with Richard here, of Poe's own detective stories and how much you in fact see those as offering you ways to read things like Ligeia and the other tales you looked at.
Yes, yeah, I think that I don't care for the Dupin stories. I mean, they're fine. He's the first detective and all, but those are not really true detective stories in the way that I look at detective stories. So yes, I think that Ligeia, The Fall of the House of Usher, William Wilson, The Pit and the Pendulum, The Telltale Heart. What else have I got? The Cask of Amontillado, The Oblong Box, The Gold Bug. course, the Assignation in Huntsville. I think those are all murder mysteries. And I have actually just finished my 20-year project of a book that I'm hoping will be published soon. I don't have a definite answer on that yet, but those are all, I see them as mysteries, and I see them as the years went on, that Poe decided, like in the Dupin stories, we've got the classic, the detective and the narrator who helps explain things, that Poe chose not to explain things as he went on. As he said about Barnaby Rudge, he said, he didn't like it that everything was explained at the end. He figured that a reader would be able to figure it out. And I see that in things like The Black Cat and The Cask of Amontillado, which I have a really very new reading on, which I will discuss at some point. But I see, and I also see them as in terms of teaching Poe, that they're very good examples for close reading for students, those stories, to ask them what they think. I mean, if you look at Rowena's Bedroom Chamber, and I say, they read it, and of course, if you just read it, you don't see it, but you say, would you draw that bedroom for me, please? And when they do something like that, they say, oh, those are coffins there in the corner, aren't they? And things like that. But in any case, that's where I am right now.
Thank you.
Is it Jacqueline who, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Barbara, go ahead.
Is it Jacqueline who talked about Clarice Lispector?
Yes, yes.
I've taught her Hour of the Star, both the novel and the film. And I just wondered if you could give us a little sense more of how she approached Poe and how you think that her attention to Poe was, made. How did she become interested? Because Hour of the Star is doesn't seem, except there's kind of a curious ending, but it's so profoundly sad.
Yes, I think Clarice Lispector has a very different style than Poe, because of a lot of things, but I think she brings a little bit of her style to the short stories, and then she created more adaptations, and they saw these as adaptations and not as translations, because she was bringing a little bit of her style. But I think if you just see these adaptations and Clarice's works, I read this at first, and I was an avid reader of Clarice, and I didn't know it was her writing. So I think it's really interesting to see how different styles she could assume. But now, looking after studying Poe, I can see a bit of her in here, but at first it was very different, and it's very interesting. And actually, I want to go back to this now and compare to Clarice. I think it would be a very nice, there's a very interesting paper in here, but
yes,
very different from The Hour of the Star and her, but she has also the text that I love most from Clarice are her short stories, and she has one of my favorite, it's called Love, and she just sees a blind man chewing gum, and then that she goes into some introspection and the whole story is all about that. So it's very different, but maybe this is closer to her short story styles, and maybe her short stories are kind of a transition between her long fiction and what she did here as adaptations. But I would like to go back into this and look more into that. And your question kind of makes me want to go stop my thesis and go look at this.
Oh, well, don't do that. But it was someday, it would be really.
Like Renata was saying, we can always find new ways to look into Poe and versions and translations and adaptations. And I think that's the most interesting and fascinating thing about Poe's writings, and translations and adaptations and all of that. So
what is the date of that publication? When did she publish that?
This one, I think this was the original edition, which was only 7 short stories, and it
Yes.
is from 1974.
1974.
But,
Okay,
but
thank you.
I think Clarice, I don't recall if this was posted after her. No, she died later on. But yeah, but then there is also 11 stories, and I even think I have here. Then she made more adaptations, and also I find it interesting the 7 they chose to write. We have Valdemar, The Red Death, William Wilson, The Black Cat, Amontillado, manuscript found in a bottom, The Telltale Heart in this first. So it's interesting the selection that that they
True,
chose.
true. Well, thank you.
Yes.
Amy's calling my attention to 2 raised hands, Tracy and then Leslie. So,
No.
no, okay,
No,
Leslie?
that's correct. That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Tracy, then Leslie.
Okay.
I was also going to ask something about Liz Spector, but I think it may have mostly been answered. But I'm interested in her. I haven't read her, but I want to, because she's being compared to Alice Munro sometimes, who's a writer I'm very interested in. I take it from what you're saying there, it's implied that there's the distinction between a translation and an adaptation is difficult, unstable. Is that true?
I think what they meant by adaptation is that she was not translating word by word.
Okay.
At least I asked about this to my fiance because he's from translation studies, and he was trying to explain me, but
Yeah.
I think they meant that she could be more free to change some passages. And I need to do a close reading of both texts, but she omits a part of the text, and she changes a little bit of the stories. And I think especially the Black Cat, it's modified here, but I would have to go back into that. But I think what they meant with adaptations is that she was free not only to change words and even titles a little bit, but also to adapt the stories to the Brazilian public.
Thank
That's
you.
exactly what I know. Thank you.
Thank you. Could we go to Tracy and Leslie and Carol?
Thank you.
I'm good.
He spoke.
Yeah.
Leslie then?
I wanted to thank you so much, Richard, for this terrific panel. It was so inspiring and interesting. And I had a question kind of for all of the panelists. It's a little bit vague, but I was wondering, I was really noticing how some of the panelists showed us passages that were then close read, and other panelists spoke about the importance of sound. Hearing Poe. I've been thinking a lot about the rise of the audio lately because that's important for my students, I've found out. And I wonder, and we, sound and speech, and certainly Poe's poetry, sound is just crucial. And I wonder what the panelists think about the relationship between reading and sound and speech in their interest in Poe.
I would like to just offer that, having worked in speech, hearing, and voice for so many years, it is fascinating that the use of voice combined with the visual is so important. And I think that's how I developed my mediumship and all of the connections with whatever's out there. Energy, it never dies. And I would encourage anybody teaching students to read it out loud and to read it with emotion, even going to putting your hand on your heart or put your hand on your lower psychic center, but the vocalization of it absolutely connects with whoever wrote the passages. It's and that's what the authors on the other side want you to do. They want you to be connected to them. Use the voice, use the sound. And let me add one more thing, to sing the passages sometimes. Doesn't matter, it can be to the tune of Happy Birthday, but it raises the vibration and makes the connection with, whatever's on the other side of the veil, so to speak. Just a thought, singing and saying it out loud.
Well, in this, to a large extent, is really carrying Poe's project forward. I mean, this is, I think it's one of the points that Jerome McGann makes that really resonates, in that we're really starting, when we're talking about Poe's poetry, we're really starting to approach what Louis Zukowski called the upper limit music, right? And that really seems to be where Poe oriented so much of his poetic writing, was in that performative space, where really it becomes, when we are reading closely, we're really listening to a musical composition. We're really attending to what William Carlos Williams would say, the small or large machinery of the poem. And so I think that those performative aspects and those sonic aspects are so important to not just a careful attention, but to really get close to the fullness of what Poe is doing, particularly when we're talking about his poetry.
Yes, Carol.
Yeah, this is for Mary Beth. I may have missed it. Where did you say that you met this man named Edgar Allan Poe?
You mean the most recent in my medical speech pathology in Laguna Hills, California. In a local
Okay, because over the weekend, a friend of mine from Baltimore called me and said she knows Edgar Allan Poe III, and she gave me his phone number, but I haven't had a chance to call him yet because of some personal issues.
Where did she say, what's the area code of the phone number?
It's Baltimore. It's downstairs.
Oh, yeah, I'm Southern California. Yeah, San Clemente, California.
Yeah, so I intend to call him. She said that what she knows about him, he's descended from Henry.
Wow. I don't doubt it. And the name is spelled the same and everything.
Yes, absolutely.
Right,
absolutely.
Right. I was really frustrated. I mean, come on, I've been doing this 30, 40 years, and I walk into the patient's room expecting, okay, another stroke or, head injury or Parkinson's or something. And, there it is. But he literally, I mean, I have to laugh and say he's followed me around. Now, my more woo-woo friends in the metaphysical area that I walk would also say, oh, you must have had a past life with him, or oh, this or that. But I just say, I find it fascinating, the synchronicities. And you know what, for what it's worth, it's lots of fun and it's very nourishing and joyous. So yeah, I would call that.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm noticing two things. Scott is mentioning that he has a panel at the Boston Poe Conference on Poe and Sound, and he's inviting proposals. So that's a possibility. And also Susan has raised her hand, so let me call on Susan.
I wanted to say about the vocalization of Poe in terms of classrooms. Well, in this last year, everything has been online, but I also always offer the audible version of a Poe story. But in classes, and often, except for maybe the Telltale Heart, that the stories are too long to read out loud. But I do like to read out some passages of Poe, because the prose in some cases is so beautiful. The first paragraph of The Fall of the House of Usher, and even some of the Telltale Heart. So I do think it works in that way to read out loud.
I do remember a story I read somewhere about coming back to the fellow whose name was Edgar Allan Poe, that there was a famous college football quarterback in the late 19th century whose name was Edgar Allan Poe. And somebody inquiring about him said, is he related to the great Edgar Allan Poe? And the answer was, he is the great Edgar Allan Poe. Other questions, comments?
Maybe Mary Beth, if you have something that's not too long, one of the poems that
Sure.
you referenced.
I would love to, if you don't mind. Thank you. Yeah, I don't think it's too long. One of the things I'll say is that there were so many of them that, like I said, I just wrote to dictation. So it's been years for me to research, and I'm sure you all know even tons more than I do. But one of the ones that really touched my heart once I started researching was this one. It's called The Ugly Sun, the Moonlit Maiden. The ugly sun, the moonlit maiden, the mother shields them all. Brother, sissy, they are one. Starved for the art, starved for the pall. No match was made, roots all torn up, served up so raw and cold. Derelict in duty, no matter then, a brother's arms were taken. Before the soldiers called his name, a fancied path was taken. The start, a crime, offense was taken. Seemed best to lose, misjudged, mistaken, a blister on a wart, the crime. Diseased, then broken, no money, so called it my misfortune. To work in art, a freer man, still seemed a better way. Were chance be given, I'd repeat the folly, sent to art's kinder, gentler arms. No mistake, no going back, no brethren, no regards. The apple of a mother's eye would always feed the hunger, a cheek so cold upon grave marker. Delicious soup, the arts, the way once served when roots went cold. Destroyed, delayed, detained, price, lively, elegant chatter. Upon a page and all rolled up was all that seemed to matter. The judges fair, the judgment sound. To the apple of a mother's eye, the distance didn't matter. Breathtaking love was always there, no kinder, gentler soul. A life was short and hurried up, the distance didn't matter. Allowance seemed in one man's coat, the apple of a mother's eye. The roots were cold and still the poison, no breakfast did it make. The distance didn't matter. The cellar and the shelves were bare, the heart's another matter. The taste is so much sweeter now, oh, this celestial stew. No matter servings once served up, the parcel's all the matter. Thank you.
And I think earlier, did you show us an example before we started the meeting of the writing?
Yeah, I was, and I apologize for the low-tech presentation, but the way it started to come was, see, I would find scraps of paper all over the floor. And then the writing got smaller, and unfortunately I wrote on, like old emails and my travel arrangements, and I just wrote on whatever was there. But it's interesting, the progression of the handwriting, because I don't remember, but I mean, I got so that I was a real good listener and I got more and more precise. But then there were times when he was just so strong in what he was saying, the words and the handwriting got so much bigger. And it would be almost to the letter. It's funny because you can't see it, but he wrote through me with his dashes that we love so much with him. And there was a rare word, the handwriting was, or the spelling was his archaic spelling. And then he would write something, how he was so into random words, and he made the Poe words, the Poe vocabulary, and he came up with so many. In this, I had to keep looking in an old 1828 Webster's dictionary to find the words that he was talking about. So the thing was that I just didn't edit myself. I was so used to writing to dictation, and it wouldn't be until quite a bit after that I started to research what the heck is he talking about. And there's one where he talks about how he died, and well, I shouldn't give it away, but the spelling was incorrect, and the punchline was, I thought he said mustard, the condiment, and he was referring to being mustard. And again, I had no idea what I was writing about, none whatsoever. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you. It's fascinating.
It's remarkable. And he was hysterically funny because he called people on all their BS. and he called out Griswold, and it's hysterical. There's a short story where he just calls out Griswold, and I mean, he really sets the record straight. Or the fact he calls people out on impotence, and you think he's writing about all this phallic stuff and how he and Ginny didn't consummate, but the last line of the poem is something to the effect, but impotence is in the lack of prose. And I just thought, how cute. He was entertaining, and he's a sweetheart, and he's happy where he is.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Are there other thoughts and comments, questions that people would like to make? Alex.
Totally beside the point, and I should know this, but I really noticed Susan Taines here, and I wanted to say thank you for all the stuff you've done for Poe, but is it beyond the pale to ask how you began collecting Poe?
Susan?
Oh, we can't hear her. We can't hear you.
So we can't hear you, Susan. Can you unmute?
I don't think. Yeah. Oh, there. I think you're.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I started collecting Poe as an accident. My family had always read. We had a small house with bookcases on each side of the fireplace, and when we would finish reading something, the next person would read it. We'd finish. They went to the libraries, the local libraries, the VA hospital, any place we could send them. So we were always moving books. And one day I was in the New York Antiquarian Book Fair, and I was walking. I never buy anything, but I was walking down the aisles, and I love to see the tapestries and the art. And I came across a rare book dealer, and he had all these gorgeous books in leather-bound bindings on glass shelves. And I walked by and I said, oh my, isn't that so beautiful? I would love to have a library, a gentleman's library like that. Not stuff I was always giving away. And I indeed started with Nancy Drew also. But so I kept on going in that booth and going out, and the sales lady that was there, she handed, I saw this raven that was on one of the shelves, and it was so gorgeous. And I said, I have to have that. But in the meantime, I had been saving for a vacation house. So I looked at it, and she says, oh, but you have to have this if you're starting a library. And I said, oh my God, I love it, but how can I afford this? It was expensive. It was $10,000, and I never spent $100 on a book, let alone $10,000 a book. And I wanted this vacation house. So I kept on walking in, and she's trying to make this sale, and she says to me, but this copy is in wrappers. I thought she was gift wrapping the book for me to take home. It was so outrageous. I had never thought, well, P.S., I bought the book. The book is sent to me. It was Stephen Lowenthal's booth of 19th Century Shop, and he was a Poe collector. So they sent I was heading to one of my husband's houses at the time in New Jersey, and they sent the book there. We were not there. It goes to a next door neighbor. The next door neighbor takes it in. He really didn't know me, thinking that he was doing a favor for my husband. And I didn't get the book. And I said, oh, this is, I've never bought a book there. I have been taken. So I call up Stephen Lowenthal in the 19th Century Shop. I said, hey, what's going on here? I gave you all this money for a book, and I don't have it. And he's saying to himself, this nut, I sent it, and I can trace it. So he goes and he traces it, and sure enough, it's next door. He says, you know what? I want to meet you. So he comes up, he says, I've got to see this crazy lady who's accusing me, of not sending her book. So he came up with some books in tow, of course, as a good bookseller would. And he started showing me these wonderful, wonderful books. I'd always been a Poe fan, and The Raven was the first poem I ever had to memorize. So I bought one, and that was it. I had 2 books. I was hooked. So you probably know more than you wanted to know.
Thank you. I will ask. I'm sure it's in one of the one of the catalog publications that you've done, but what is your count now in terms of just Poe books?
My goodness. I don't know. I just made a major donation to the Poe Museum down in Richmond. So I did send some stuff there, but I still have a huge amount. I don't know. A lot.
Thank you.
Also, Susan had an interview in the Poe Review if you want to learn more details. Remember that, Susan?
That was a
So-
long time ago.
Yeah, but still there.
Other thoughts and comments? Thank you so much, Susan and Alex. Any others?
I noticed John had a comment about if we had the Edgar Allan Poe in Baltimore meet the Edgar Allan Poe in Southern California, we'd have, or in California, sorry, we'd have the makings of a William Wilson.
Doppelganger. Doppelganger.
Well said, well said.
Well, it is Monday afternoon, so I think we'll go ahead and close up here because at least where I am, we have sunlight for a change. It's been a lot of rain here, so I'm anxious to get out, but it's been a great conversation. And I have a feeling there's a possibility maybe someone will take it over from Richard, or Richard will want to do How I Got Started with Poe Part 3. I don't know. These have been amazing, and everything Derek said and others, I've really enjoyed them. So thank you all so much. Hope to see you all in June for our ALA session recordings. Thank you, Richard.
Yeah. Thank you,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you, Amy, Richard.
Thank you. Great session.
Thank you. Take care.